Let's write test for another component called the activity form. This component is responsible for rendering the form to add new activity. And the first thing that we can check related to this component is that submit form button is initially disabled, and it will only become enabled after we input something in this input field. So let's start describing the testing scenario for this component. Let's create new file with the name the activity form. And then the first testing scenario will say it enables submit button if input field is filled. Let's import it function from the Vitest library right here. And here we are following normal procedure. The first thing we do is we render a component. In this case, I'm gonna use shallow mount function. Let's also specify component name that we are rendering, which is the activity form. And then I'm gonna output rendered markup in the terminal. And then we're gonna write our first expectation, which is going to check that submit form button is disabled initially. So let's find this button by using method find, and then we're gonna extract all the attributes of this element by calling method attributes. Actually, we need to get only value for one attribute which is disabled, so we can specify this attribute name as the first parameter right here. And eventually we are checking that this attribute will be equal to an empty string, which means this attribute will be present on the button element. Before going any further, let's check what value this attribute is going to store. I'm gonna print it out in the terminal. We're actually getting this error because we have rendered this component by using shallow mount function, which doesn't render any child elements, but the button that we are trying to find in the test hasn't actually been rendered. So we gotta render the full component, including all children. I'm gonna use mount function instead. And the test is passing now, so the first part of this test is done. Let's see what else we can check. So the moment we're gonna input something in this input field, the button to submit the form becomes enabled. We're gonna check it next. And also let's take a quick look at the implementation of the activity form component. Mainly it consists of a few elements, such as an input field as well as button to submit the form. So in the test we're actually going to find this input element, and then we have to somehow specify value for this input element to emulate that we have actually filled this input. And the way we're specifying value for the input field is by calling method called setValue, and as the first parameter we are specifying the value that we'd like this input field to be filled with. And finally, after populating this input field, we have to make sure that the disabled attribute is no longer present on the button. So I'm gonna duplicate this expectation, but in here we're checking that value of the disabled attribute will be undefined. In other words, that this attribute will no longer be present on this element. And for some reason the test is throwing an error, so let's figure out what is going on. Let's print the markup of the component right after we have populated the input field. And as we can see in here, we're still having this disabled attribute on the button, even though it should be gone after we have populated an input field. And the problem here is that Vue, when we are changing the state of the component, updates DOM asynchronously, but Vitest runs test synchronously. So Vue doesn't get a chance to update the DOM because Vitest finishes test execution. So to fix this issue, we have to make this function asynchronous and wait until Vue gets a chance to update the DOM after we have filled this input. So we have to wait for this operation to finish. Let's use await in front of this line. And because this function is now asynchronous, we have to specify keyword async right in front this test function like so. So this time, if we'll take a look at the markup once again, we will no longer see that disabled attributes because it has been successfully removed. So that means that Vue was able to update the DOM before test has finished execution. And we're seeing that the test is passing, But there is actually one more way that we can check this disabled attribute, which I'm going to use right now, and that is by calling method to have property. So in here, by calling this method, we are checking that the disabled property is actually present on the attributes object. And down here, we're also going to use this method to have property, but this time let's also use modifier not in front of calling this method. This way we are negating this check and checking that the disabled attribute will no longer be present on the attributes object after we have populated an input field. And the test is still passing. So we are expecting this test to fail if we're not gonna populate an input field. Let's check it out. I'm gonna comment out this line and check test execution. It is failing, just like we expect. So with that, we are finishing writing our first testing scenario for the activity form component. Let's continue in the next lesson.